I am a baby boomer. How do I know this? Because I was born between 1946 and 1964. At least that's when they say my generation was born. While the concept of a generation has a long history, the generations we are familiar with, like baby boomers, are an American invention. Here's a few of them you might have heard of. The Lost Generation, the Greatest Generation, Silent Generation, Baby Boomers, Generation X, Millennials, Generation Z, and the latest one, Generation Alpha. But there are lots more. The generation before the Lost Generation, the Missionary Generation, was born between 1860 and 1882. Two of my grandparents were in the generation before that. They were coined the Progressive Generation and were born between 1843 and 1859. Before that, there was the Awakening Generation, the Liberty Generation, the Republican Generation, the Compromise Generation, the Transcendental Generation, and the Gilded Generation, all born between 1700 and 1842. Wow. So, who decides all this generation stuff? Well, that's hard to say because most of these are new, but from what I can tell, anyone can. There is no official body who certifies these categories or verifies the rationale behind each generation. Generation labels are just made up and are eventually accepted after getting repeated over and over and over again. A good example of how this happens is the Greatest Generation. It was named after a book written and published in 1998 by NBC anchorman Tom Brokaw. I am dead serious. It was Tom Brokaw who coined the term the Greatest Generation. It was a great book, by the way, and the name just stuck. This generation naming in America really started in 1945 following World War II. Economists, businesses, and policymakers began labeling generations as a new way to measure and study demographics. It was all about how to market a certain age group, and they started with the baby boomers. Yes, they wanted to figure out the best way to sell us stuff, and they were pretty good at it. Today, it's sociologists, TV anchormen like Brokaw, and anyone else who wants to write a book. There are researchers, though, who say generational labels are a dumb idea. And it's the latest one, Generation Alpha, that they're pointing to as an example of a dumb idea. Generation Alpha applies to children born between 2013 and 2025, but some say it starts in 2010 or 2011. That would overlap Generation Z, so that's how screwed up this generation thing is. Generation Alpha was coined by an Australian sociologist named Mark McCrindle. Man, he looks happy. A little too happy. Probably because he got all the credit. Ashley Fell was also an author, but McCrindle gets all the press. But she looks happy too. They came up with this new generation, then wrote a book to make it official. At least in their mind it's official, but so far it is stuck because the Pew Institute and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, along with a whole bunch of others, used the term even though the book was only published in 2021. The Pew Institute caught some grief over it because a whole bunch of researchers wrote an open letter to the foundation saying the whole thing was nonsense and the institute should get their act together by applying some scientific principles and not validate every generation somebody invents. I agree, because some of these alpha kids haven't even been born yet. But McCrindle has already stereotyped them by talking about their tendencies and traits and how best to raise these kids. His rationale is because they're the first generation entirely born in the 21st century. Good grief. Yeah, that's dumb. But man, I could have been giving out generational labels all these years, like the Joe and Steve generation. Well, the Joe and Bubba generation. Steve encompasses way more of a demographic than I do. There are two men, though, William Strauss and Neil Howe, who invented some of their own generations and took this thing in another direction. They came up with a theory called the Strauss-Howe generational theory, and they weren't studying demographics to sell people stuff. According to their theory, historical events are associated with recurring generational personas that last about 20 to 25 years. That's when a new social, political, and economic climate exists. According to them, history does repeat itself, and it's on an 80-year loop. These guys laid their theory out in a book back in 1991, and they came up with the names of all these generations to go with their theory. Like the Millennials. Yep, they coined the Millennials and told us what they would be like before many of them were even born. Kind of like Generation Alpha. Now, I did read some of this book a few years ago. It's interesting, but to be honest, I only got through half of it because my head started spinning. This book gets lots of criticism. A few call it pseudoscience, while others say it's just plain kooky, which is probably why I didn't finish it. The critics say the Strauss-Howell theory doesn't consider things such as economic class, race, sex, religion, or even political parties. And the critics are right, it doesn't. Unfortunately, this theory has turned into a cult prophecy. A few people, like this guy here, have focused on one key aspect of this theory and have made it their mantra. These followers believe this 80-year thing and that American history is marked by a crisis or a fourth turning, as the authors described it. The authors used the Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II as their examples, all around 80 years apart, which was very convenient for them. I should probably tell you that this fourth turning destroys the old world order and creates a new one. They didn't have a cult back in 1991, but if enough people believe something this kooky, well, one doesn't have to look very far to see the obsession a few have with this theory. To me, it's more astrology than science. There are other eras that have been labeled by real historians, and I'm sure you've heard of some of them. There is the Humanist, the Reformation, the Elizabethan, the Puritan, and the Enlightenment era, also known as the Age of Reason, and the list goes on. But these eras weren't about generations. They were about different periods defined by historical events and historical people. The Strauss-Howell theory is all about generations they created to fit their narrative. To me, history happens, and then you have the luxury of hindsight to label it what you want, based on real events. Not twist it around like these guys did and predetermine we're all going to hell in a handbasket because it's time. It doesn't work that way, and I hope we prove them wrong. Now, what is real are the differences of opinion between each generation. You know, generation gaps. Here's an example. They think they know everything and are always quite sure about it. That was Aristotle in the 4th century BC. That's right, trash talk 400 years before the Romans arrived. And it continues to this day with the older generation criticizing the younger ones. George Orwell had a good take on it. Every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it, and wiser than the one that comes after it. Sometimes the younger generation gives it back, though. You familiar with, "Okay, boomer"? I am. And what did we boomers say to the generation before us? "Up yours," if I recall. So, why has bashing the younger generation been around for thousands of years? Well, some speculate we do it because we're afraid that everything has been built by previous generations will now be destroyed by the new one. Well, I don't buy it. Each generation carries on some of their parents' traditions. They keep their names and sometimes adopt their politics and religion, although that's not always the case. In our children, we seek immortality sometimes, but when they grow up, we discover they're not us. They are their own people who find their own politics, beliefs, and form their own opinions, just like we did. I think what makes us afraid is that each generation thinks they're going to slip away and be forgotten and have all their stuff thrown away. Not that the next generation is going to screw things up. Every generation will have their time in the sun, and history will judge us after we're long gone, not before. And the generations after us will complain about the youth just like we have. Then they'll be replaced, and so on and so forth. History may not remember me, but it will remember my generation, at least for a while. You know, I think the only advice I would give future generations is to not take themselves too seriously, like we did. That's all I got.